My name is Kristy Matheson. I'm the Director of Film at ACMI in Melbourne. And before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land we meet, to their elders, past, present, and to emerging leaders. I'll be blunt. What I could tell you about genre cinema, I could fit in a thimble. But don't despair, because the two people sitting here with me know a lot about it. And just quickly a little more. Alex, who's here, she has written seven books, it's kind of amazing, on cult, exploitation, horror cinema, including the soon-to-be-released Eyes Without Faces, Masks in Horror Cinema, and 1,000 Women in Horror, which has been optioned for a TV documentary series. Congratulations. Alex is a programming consultant for Fantastic Fest in Austin, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's one of the preeminent genre festivals in the world. And joining us as well is Dr. Mark Ryan, Associate Professor at School of Creative Practice at QUT. Mark has served as the President of the Screen Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, Executive Member of the Australian Screen Producers Education and Research Association. He's an expert in industries research, Australian genre cinema, digital media and genre cinema film studies, and the co-editor of Directory of World Cinema, Australia and New Zealand, Volume 2. Please give them a huge round of applause. Now, this is a lightning panel. So to be very brief about why I chose these films. Genre cinema is not my thing. And so when I was asked to put a small program together, it dawned on me that the zombie has gone art house in 2019. And really, if I had to think about most of the films that I've been watching in the first part of this year, the idea of or the metaphor of possession, be that a zombie or the undead, it's literally everywhere. It keeps coming up. This is a quote. Zombies don't have souls. They don't have identities. They're drifting from identity into non-identity. Zombies are a metaphor for people who are not conscious of having lost their consciousness. Now, this could be somebody describing any page of the news in the last, let's call it, the last 10 years, really. But this is a quote from the American director Jim Jarmusch. And his very broad, very fun zombie comedy, The Dead Don't Die, which screens tonight, it's in fact a very desperate, angry howl at the world that we're currently living in and the environmental destruction that we are bringing upon ourselves. So we're going to unpack a little bit of politics. We are going to unpack a little bit of chronology of the zombie. But before we get to that, I want to ask both of our panellists, in this pantheon of movie monsters, zombies are super adaptable on a semiotic level, but do you guys think that they are cinema's most versatile movie monster? Or even just your favourite, and why?
Well, first of all, I'm going to call you out, Kristy. I saw a horror movie with you in Toronto like a month ago, and there were like, you know, beard flannel dudes who were like freaking out. Kristy and I are like front row, and she's like, yeah,
I'm a
you
bit
were tough
squeamish.
as guts. You were tough as guts. I don't see horror iconography as like a kind of battle, you know, it's not Jason versus Freddy. So I think they're all my children. I cannot choose between them. I think that our delicious horror monsters all have certain strengths, perhaps weaknesses, but I think that they do different things and appeal to different parts of our brain, both intellectually, but also in terms of the pleasures that they offer. So I think that the kind of the sensuality of the vampire versus perhaps the more sort of visceral thrills of the zombie, we can't compare them. We can't compare them.
Mark, where do you stand? Are you a zombie or a vampire guy? What do you think the zombie can do that its werewolf and vampire friends are less adept at?
Yes, I love zombies. I think it's increasingly becoming a subgenre of choice for directors, like for personal expression. And I think every genre gets to a point where it gets a little bit tired and worn and cliche. And I think the zombie subgenre in particular is at a point where directors are taking it and kind of experimenting with the genre more and more and writing their own rules. And when you see the Jim Jarmusch film tonight as well, I think you really see that. He's kind of making up his own rules and kind of playing around with the formula. So I think, yeah, the zombie, I think all the main types of monsters, so werewolf, probably less so werewolf, but definitely vampire and zombie, kind of cycle in and out. but the zombie has been particularly popular in the last few years. And I think it's at a point where it's becoming really self-conscious and people are playing with it and kind of adapting it according to their own personal styles and kind of whims and so on. And yeah, no, I love gothic horror, but I do love the zombie film.
So it is something that's been with cinema for a very long time. So Alex, do you want to talk us through when we sort of first met this cinematic creature, or really this idea of the zombie and where it comes from?
Yeah, this is a sort of the little history lesson part, so just yellow card me if it gets a bit too dull. When we talk about zombies, we really can't avoid talking about 1804, which is the year that Haiti got its independence from France. Sexy, huh? Come on. Yeah. So Haiti, before that, the French very much had an entire industry in Haiti built on slave labour, which suddenly, with this pesky independence and this crazy idea that people have for basic human rights and a spirit of free will, the French needed to demonise the local population, and they did that through their religious beliefs. Now, if you put this into a bit of kind of historical perspective, Haiti gains independence in 1804 from the French. It's not until 2003 that voodoo becomes an officially recognised religion in Haiti. That's almost 200 years, and I actually had to do the math because I'm real bad at numbers. So there's a long, long history there of this being a kind of underground, unrecognised, but very, very prolific religion. Zombies it was a PR stunt, basically, the kind of monsterising or monsterisation or othering of zombies. It's like, look how bad these people who want their independence are. They believe in the dead rising. And that just got picked up by literature and eventually film and really run with. So we have there's a really famous book by a guy called William Seabrook from 1929 called The Magic Island, which is supposedly a travelogue, but it's all about this very exoticized idea of voodoo religious practices that really exploits and kind of others this idea of zombies as this sort of, ooh, they're so weird. Ooh, ooh. So it's just steeped in colonial history. So by the time we get to film, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think we tend to think, and we'll touch on this soon, we tend to think of Night of the Living Dead as the moment that zombies became political. Zombies were always political. It's about free will. If you ever see a little kid learning to eat broccoli and they spit it out, they're fighting for their free will. It's Extinction Rally, but broccoli. Free will is like a driving, and I think that's really at the heart of why zombie films and zombie culture is so fascinating to us, because it just gets to the heart of our fear of losing our free will. So in film, we can go back to the universal horror films, things like White Zombie, the brilliant Bela Lugosi film, which is actually, it's not the brains kind of stuff, but it's actually more about sex trafficking. It's sort of this beautiful brain-dead blonde woman, and the idea that she would become a sort of sex slave to this Eastern European other, this sort of Bela Lugosi character. We have films, I Walk with the Zombie, the beautiful 1943 Jacques Tourneur film. A lot of you guys are nodding, and we're all going to drink wine together and talk about how much we love that film, which is basically a reworking of Jane Eyre. It's just beautiful, and it's a very strong critique of this kind of racial history and colonialisation that lies at the heart of zombie culture. Really interesting film called Revenge of the Zombies with John Carradine from 1943, which is where we start to see the Nazi zombie trope, a personal favourite of mine. Dead Snow, not the first to do it. But a really interesting film as well, which predates Night of the Living Dead, is called Plague of the Zombies, which I don't know if anybody's seen Plague of the Zombies. Hey, there's one. You can all go home and watch Plague of the Zombies. 1966. It's a Hammer horror film which deals with the zombification, basically, of tin miners. So it's like we're going to have miners, but we're going to make them zombies, so they'll just do our bidding. And if you take that back to the slave labour origins of the kind of othering of zombies in Haiti, but also weigh that up against what was going on with the Welsh coal miners at the time, zombies have always been political. Night of the Living Dead, important film, but certainly not the first film to kind of click onto this politics.
Well, it's interesting because there's a new French film called Zombie Child by the director Bertrand Bonello, which is a wonderful film which I'm sure it will be out in cinemas, within the next 6 months or so. But he is, in this film, it's quite interesting because he's going back to this Haitian roots of the zombie. And in his wrap-up for Cannes, Dennis Lim quite rightly notes that, that's not a story that Bonello, he himself, can tell. So he puts this next to this contemporary French schoolgirl story, which is very interesting. But this idea of this apparently real person, Clarius Narcissi. Who
Has anybody seen Serpent in the Rainbow, the Wes Craven film? It's the same guy.
Yeah,
it's based on the same real guy from Haiti.
And this idea that this man was, zombified through drugs, buried, and then really it was about being able to use people as free and cheap slave labour in the sugarcane fields. So his film is quite interesting because it's taking this very historical view of the zombie and putting that within a brand new filmic space. And it's a beautiful film. It's very lush and gorgeous, as are all of his films. But really it is Night of the Living Dead, and it's Romero. When people think of film zombies, that's where they go. So Mark, what is significant about this film, and what's significant about this time when he's making Night of the Living Dead?
I'm not sure politically. I'm sure you can say more about it politically. But I mean, genrically, it's kind of, the film that kind of established the archetype of the slow-moving zombie in particular. And then the series of films that followed really kind of entrenched that idea of the modern tropes of the zombie film around flesh eating, coming in hordes, slow-moving hordes. If you're getting bitten, you get turned into a zombie. So it really kind of changed the face of what the zombie genre stood for and kind of made it more mainstream, popularized it. And then for many, many years, that was the zombie subgenre until we get, deep, into the 2000s, I guess. But politically, I mean, the Romero zombie was, it became a metaphor for a whole range of critiques on society, and corporate kind of commercialism and consumerism in particular was the big one.
Yeah, Dawn of the Dead really, I mean, the great idea of setting a zombie film in a horror, in a shopping mall,
it's a fairly, like the Jarmusch film, it's a blunt instrument, the metaphor here, but it's really effective.
And that first film, I mean, there's that quite famous anecdote that, it was a self-funded indie film, and the night that he had it in his car, I think he was driving from Pittsburgh to New York. I'm sure you guys know this story better than I do. And he had the cans of film in the back, and he was ready to start distributing this film. And he hears on the radio that Martin Luther King has been assassinated. So it just tapped perfectly. He always said that, I think it's Ben, so forgive me, it's been a while since I've seen it, but the black male main character in that film, he was like, he was the only person I knew who could act. I think he was perhaps being a little, disingenuous there. I think that Romero was a super smart guy and knew exactly what he was doing. He tapped into the zeitgeist. I mean, you can't watch the final scenes of that film today and still not be devistated. I mean, it really upsets me now. I can't imagine how that film felt to watch at the time. You can't, it's one of those moments where text and subtext just collapse in on each other. You can't watch Night of the Living Dead and not read it through race relations in the United States, both then and now.
But this is what's quite interesting about the zombie, because, the film we just saw is, it is a really deeply political film, and I think that Abe Forsyth is, like the Jarmusch film, like the Denis Cotier film, they're angry about things and they're making very big political points, but it's almost this flexible space whereby you can go there. And, the Romero film in particular, it's like a pizza party movie as well. Like, it's a film that people can also enjoy. And Mark, do you think that for younger filmmakers, that's a lot of the appeal of why the zombie keeps coming back?
Yeah, definitely. It's also, a big part of it is that it's a low-budget genre. Right. So I feel as though, in contrast to some, creature features or perhaps the vampire movie, the zombie film can be done on a really low budget, and it can be done really well on a low budget. So it's also a good calling card. It's a good way for young filmmakers to make their mark. So I feel as though the generic tropes of the zombie film are kind of contained enough within a low budget genre for young filmmakers to be able to kind of take them and experiment with them to kind of mix things up a bit and add their own flavour. And so I think this film is a great example of that. You know, it's got a really nice tone. It's quite funny. Yeah, he's kind of like used the conventions of the zombie film well, and kind of just added enough of his own flavour to kind of make it novel, and so on. So I think it kind of, because it is low budget, lots of young filmmakers kind of experiment with the form and use it as a way to break in and make their name with the subgenre.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I wrote a book on found footage horror, and there are a huge amount of zombie found footage horror films precisely because of that reason. There's a wonderful line, I know a lot of you guys just saw Little Monsters, but there's a wonderful line we were just talking about before we came on, where one of the kids comments that the zombies just look like crap. It's like, and how do you get away with, like, you can't get away with that in another kind of film. There's something about
vampires
zombies
are too cool.
where
You can't do that in vampire world.
That kind of
No.
shoddy campness. Yeah. But there's a really interesting film. It's got quite a strong cult reputation called Pathogen, which was made by a young woman called Emily. I've got her name here. Emily Haggins. She made this film called Pathogen in 2006, and there's a documentary on the making of it called Zombie Girl. When we say young filmmakers, she was 12. She made a feature film when she was 12. It's exactly the kind of film that you can imagine a 12-year-old girl making. The documentary is really quite incredible.
Zombie My Little Ponies, or how does that work?
I mean, Emily's a grown-up now. You know, she makes grown-up films. There's an anthology out at the moment called Scare Package. She has a short in that. So she's been making films the whole time. But one of the things that I found most amazing about this film wasn't actually the zombie stuff. It was that she was a 12-year-old girl who was filming other 12, 13-year-old girls at this time of puberty that we just don't see represented on screen, certainly not through a female gaze, and certainly not through the gaze of one of their peers. So the way that kids, when you're that age, your boobs go funny. They're sort of not, you don't go straight from flat to double D. I mean, me specifically, but there's sort of this weird in-between stage. Is this going off topic? Am I talking too much about boobs?
I like this film.
We'll just talk more about the boobs. But it's interesting because we don't see that stage on film very often at all, really. It's sort of this sort of invisible stage of women and girls' lives. And to see that film from the perspective of a 12-year-old girl is incredible. And the brain eating just makes it even more fun.
I was just going to say, the preschoolers in this as well. I mean, that was really refreshing to see, right?
Yeah,
and I love the tone of this film, how kind of strangely upbeat it is. You know, a lot of zombie films and zombie television at the moment is extremely nihilistic. If you've been watching Walking Dead or Z Nation or any of those, oh my goodness, by the end of a season, you just kind of like, what's the point? It's all over, But I mean, that was quite an upbeat film, and seeing representations of kind of, preschoolers kind of in a zombie apocalypse, I thought was really clever and really well done.
I think the jam fight is my favourite line in the whole thing.
It's so well written. I mean, that's a really well written screenplay.
Well, they apparently, in order to make Little Monsters as a quick diversion, Miss Caroline was Miss Caroline to all those children from about a month out, and she even made lesson plans for the little kids who you see in the film. So whenever they spoke to her, they called her Miss Caroline, and they believed that she was their preschool teacher. They said it was really hard to shoot a lot of the language in that film around the children, so they would shoot around them, and then the scenes where the adults really let loose with the C-bombs and the F-bombs, the children were not in shot there. So really, I guess, you mentioned The Walking Dead, obviously Game of Thrones in recent memory, but once we get, we have Romero in the end of The Summer of Love, we go through Greed is Good, we come out in the 2000s, really post 9/11, and whammo, the zombie is back. So do you want to talk us through some of those key moments post 9/11?
So 28 days later, was the big one that kind of re-established the modern zombie. Even though Undead, the Australian zombie film, was
which
produced
is a
before it.
Great
and
film.
It was definitely a really novel
the
film.
Fish punching. It's the only film I've ever seen of a zombie fish punched in the face.
It
I
is
want to see that
actually
more.
the first film that represents a zombie animal. So it
I'm
wasn't.
so glad you're here, Mark. I didn't know that.
Sorry, Australian genre specialist. Very limited, limited field.
This is what we're here for. Content. Bring the content.
Right. But so, I mean, so those movies started to bubble out because there was quite a lull in the zombie subgenre.
Yeah, I mean,
for quite a
zombies
lot.
really, if you think about cinema of the 90s, and again, I wasn't watching a lot of genre cinema, but really that's where the
It's
zombie
more the slasher film.
had to go live. The zombie was not, 28 Days was a very mainstream, independent film. The zombie wasn't in that space, really at all, but it comes back with a force. And the zombies are different, which I think would be great to unpack how they change.
And so that's really where the fast zombie was popularized and started to emerge as the new kind of the mainstream representation of the zombie. But it's interesting now where filmmakers make a choice. And it's kind of like, what's your favorite type of zombie almost? And I love in this film how they're like, is it fast or is it slow? And literally now, I mean, there is no kind of logic as to whether it's fast or slow zombie in contemporary films. It's kind of really depends on the choice of the director. But in the 2000s, because the Romero zombie, it was hinted, it was suggested at the origin of the infection of the zombie plague. It was I think it was a satellite, like a military satellite or something like that, whereas in the 28 Days Later, it's not ambiguous at all. It's some type of viral virus that's been part of the rage virus.
But this idea of the military is interesting, isn't it? Like this idea that, the zombie often is in a space where society's broken down, but we, as the general populace, we can't trust the military. They're somehow behind it, and that's a really great part of 28 Days, really, isn't it? Because it's got all that hyper paranoia in it, that film.
I think that also feeds from that long history of Nazi zombie films like The Frozen Dead and stuff like that again predate Night of the Living Dead. It's interesting, that sort of militarized the idea of the brainless army. It's not a complex metaphor, but I do think it's a quite powerful one.
And so then how does this dovetail into, you have this big film, 28 Days, which does very well internationally. It really kind of reinvigorates the genre. But then you've also got video games sitting alongside that space. Yeah,
the Resident Evil films in particular really came into the fore and became a really massive, powerful franchise kind of alongside. And then I guess Fast Zombies continued to be the fore for probably a decade. But now I think it's kind of, the zombie monster has kind of broken out beyond the horror genre. And so you mentioned Game of Thrones. I mean, the zombie monster is appearing in all sorts of stuff now, the White Walkers being the big one. But I think now we're at a point where the subgenre is really, really diverse, and it's increasingly becoming more so. Zomcoms, romantic zombie comedies are becoming more and more popular. Shaun of the Dead. Warm Bodies, if you've ever seen that. I mean, that was an interesting one because that was a point where it really popularized that idea of the zombie becoming more human, the humanization of the zombie and, them having a relationship or whatever. But that's like a landmark point in the contemporary history of the genre because as you introduce, the zombie's always been this mindless kind of in between dead and alive, and our greatest fear represented back to us of losing our identity, losing our sense of self, becoming an undead. But increasingly in contemporary films, we're seeing people are having relationships with zombies. We're keeping, if our relative gets killed, we kind of keep them around, even though they're still a zombie. I mean,
there's a lot of creepy moments splattered through The Walking Dead where there are zombie pets, which really was, I was like, wow, I've got to check out of this show. Which was such a disturbing concept.
I would be remiss as a devoted fan of Italian zombie films. So Italian zombie films are my favourite horror films, my favourite zombie horror films. And these really emerged out of the Vatican II during the 1960s, where I've got this written down because I'm not big on my Vatican history. Second Vatican Council.
It's terrible, Alex. You should really be across the paper.
The Pope. He's gonna smote me. Do popes smote? Is that something that they do? No?
My papal knowledge is very poor. Wrong person to ask. Zombies and the Pope.
I'm going to get tweeted. No, popes don't smote. Second Vatican Council, it's all about the sanctity of the soul. So we get this really interesting movement. Just, I mean, Italian horror in the 70s, late 60s goes crazy from that point onwards. And part of it, you almost get the feeling, it's like The Exorcist, where it's almost like proving that evil exists as a way of confirming God exists. But then you get the flip side to that, which is actually subverting it. And that's, I think, where the most fun Italian horror films and certainly the most fun zombie films. But I come onto this subject because I just need to mention Joe D'Amato's Porno Holocaust. I just wanted to put that out there. I mean, zombies have been
Tell
loving...
us about this film.
You don't need to know anything more than the title. It's a zombie film called Porno Holocaust. There's a softcore and a hardcore version. Zombies have been loving for a long time. That's all I'm saying. Horny zombies are not new.
That's even more disturbing than the pets in The Walking Dead. But
Zombies as Slaves is becoming a new one, where, you know, kind of contemporary anxieties around AI and the implications of robots, you know, being commercialized and so on. Increasingly in some zombie films, you know, there's representations of using zombies as domestic labor, slave labor, corporate labor, all those type of things. So it kind of gets back to your point earlier about how, you know, it is a metaphor that gets applied to certain anxieties and so on in whatever the time frame is.
And as the genre has kind of moved along through this particular decade, do you think that in its relationship to video games, have they kind of kept pace? Or in the video game world, is it still very much, they're not humanising the zombie, it's really just get rid of the zombie? Or is there a correlation between...
Well, I'm going to give a shout out for Minecraft. I'm probably the only person over the age of 8 that's ever done that publicly. Zombies in Minecraft are not, it's not viral, it's just caused by being out at night. I like that you're nodding. Either you're really into Minecraft or you've got a little kid. No. I didn't mean to demean your husband. Respect. But no, I think that's interesting that it's like the virality of zombies is actually not what makes them interesting in Minecraft. They're a horde. They're a, I should know this. They're a, what kind of horde are they? Come on. A mob. They're a mob. They're a hostile mob. Oh my God, my child would have not locked me out of the house if I didn't mention that.
So, I mean, I think this is really the thing with zombies, though. Zombies are never about zombies. So they can be about lots of different things. I mean, obviously they really are about colonialism, and I mean, there's another great film that's screening at the festival as part of an Indigenous horror anthology called Dark Place, and there's a film within that anthology that's, you know, the idea of a plague that's brought upon these settlers, and it's a theme that's in a new Indigenous film from Canada called Blood Quantum, which is a really wonderful film that again is looking at this idea of colonialism. So what are the more interesting metaphors and political tropes that the zombie has sort of rolled out for us in cinema?
I think one of my favourite recent films, I don't believe it's played in Australia yet, and it's possibly a stretch to even call it a quote-unquote zombie film, but they do talk, I think they specifically use the word zombification in it, is a woman called Jessica Hausner, who's an Austrian filmmaker. It's her first English language film. It's called Little Joe, and she's a genetic engineer. She makes a plant, and it's basically an antidepressant plant. And the idea is that everybody will have them in your home, and it triggers a hormone in your brain, which is called the mother hormone. So the more that you care for your plant and you look after your plant, the more this drug or this hormone is released, and it's a real biochemical reaction. So that you get a kind of a sense of well-being and happiness from caring for this plant. But the film sort of goes wrong because there's a feeling that people are happy in the wrong way. It's not the right kind of happiness. So the whole thing is this, and people, it's sort of like a cross between zombification and pod people. I mean, it's really feeding in on that sort of invasion of the body snatchers theme as well, and a little bit of Little Shop of Horrors for fun. But it's this idea of antidepressants, and we talk about that. We talk about, I don't take antidepressants because they make me a zombie. This is sort of a vernacular frame of reference that we hear regularly, when people talk about psych drugs in particular. So I think that she uses that in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I think even Jarmusch, if anyone has read any of the recent interviews he's done around this new film, he talks a lot about, there's definitely the environmental aspect, but he talks a lot, as someone who lives in New York City with very crowded footpaths, he's talking about people being zombified on their phone and not being in their world, being in another world. And so that, is a real a distraction, a detraction from the space we're in. But in terms of the zombie it embodies our fears as a sort of a social animal as well.
It's interesting to think about the zombie in the Australian context, because the Australian cinema has made hundreds of horror movies now, hundreds, lots. And, the most common types of horror movies that Australian filmmakers make are generally about killer animals, the killer landscape, or, psychos in the outback, like Wolf Creek style, right? So the zombie monster and vampires and werewolves, the kind of the more European Gothic monsters, have not translated well, typically, to an Australian cultural context. And in terms of zombie movies, I mean, there's only a handful, and this, I would argue, is probably the best of them by far.
But do you think that has something to do with our cultural denial of colonialism as well?
Yeah,
it's interesting to wonder why, because, like you say, there's a lot of killer animals.
Yeah.
Which
I think there's a number of reasons, like, that idea of verisimilitude, a kind of the logics of a genre and whether they're acceptable to an audience. So the idea of a zombie kind of running, a zombie outbreak in Brisbane City, for example, right? It's kind of like culturally, it's like, I don't know. And
so it's too much of a stretch for the audience to go there? Is that sort of...
I think because Australia is a relatively young nation with kind of a limited history, not a long history. I think the idea of kind of zombie outbreaks in the cities, and even that idea of population density that other countries like Japan and Tokyo or kind of American cities, that idea of massively being densely populated and the idea of zombie outbreaks being terrifying and so on. Culturally, that idea I don't think is quite acceptable yet in an Australian context. And the other thing is the outback, because Australia is such a vastly populated country, it's kind of, there's lots of space. And so unless you're in the cities, which I don't think is culturally acceptable, most of the stories would fall out into the kind of the outback, which is, if you want to get away from a zombie, you just drive away from it or whatever.
I love that idea. Like Train to Busan, I think, is one of the best zombie films made in the last couple of years. But you couldn't really do Train to Coolangatta. It just wouldn't. I mean, if there are any filmmakers here, that's yours. I give it to you. It's my gift to you. But I don't know if people are going to line up to see Train to Coolangatta.
Well, Cargo is a really interesting example. If you've seen Cargo, where it kind of is getting into a more culturally acceptable idea about how zombies might work, in Australia. So it is the idea that there has been some type of outbreak in the cities, but most of the action happens in the outback, and a family are kind of traveling down a river, and it is really sparse. And so in the kind of the cultural logic of Australian zombie films, that sparseness, the outback, the isolation acts as kind of a defense to an extent, and that kind of plays into how people try and survive. But in Cargo as well, there's Indigenous context, and in the context of Australian horror cinema, Indigenous perspectives is very minor, which is a real shame. So it could come back to that kind of colonial gaze. But Cargo is a really interesting example of where Indigenous cultures are sticking together, they're kind of fighting together, they have an understanding of the landscape, whereas all kind of the white non-Indigenous Australians are completely, at the mercy of the landscape as well as the zombies, and that kind of colonial fear of landscapes evident and so on. So I think Cargo was a really good example of kind of adapting the zombie mythology to the cultural context and the landscape that has relevance in terms of our history and culture.
I think Dark Place is really interesting for that. I can't remember the name of the director who does the zombie film. It's Bjorn. He's an actor. He's a wonderful actor. Bjorn Stewart. It's such I know that the timing doesn't sync up, but if you didn't know better, you would think that he's basically done like a zombie splatter comedy parody of The Nightingale. Because it's set at the same time, and it's a very similar setup.
Yeah.
I mean, the timing I don't think would work out, and I don't think that that's what he's done. But
it would
watching it now, it's really hard not to read it that way.
It's
and
very
the fact that it's
interesting.
made by an Indigenous filmmaker and it's funny and it's disgusting. Have you guys seen this? It's just grotesque and wonderful.
It's my favourite zombie that I've seen in recent times.
Really quality guts, and that's something I really appreciate.
It's a lot of pus.
Yeah, it's pussy and gutty. These are the terms that we want to. No fish were punched, but it was still pretty good. But it's a really interesting film to play against something that's much more serious. And I certainly am not criticising The Nightingale by any respect, but they're really interesting films to play against each other. That might be something to do in the future if you were demented.
Just a short before feature.
Yeah, because it's almost like the short made by the Indigenous filmmaker is sort of almost mocking. And I don't think he is. I'm definitely not saying that, but there is sort of the humour of it comes from this. Well, you think we're monsters? Let us show you monsters.
Yeah. And I think this idea of, embodied in the zombie is us. Other monsters, they come from outside. A vampire is a creation, but the zombie horde is just us. It's happened to us. And so this idea of how do we process, what would I do? What does this make me? Who am I? Do you think that these are questions that the zombie deals with quite well in cinema? I think in television it does it extremely well because you've got so much time to get invested in these people. The Walking Dead, I think it would be, interesting to get your take on that, how attached you get to those.
Yeah. I think The Walking Dead was able to explore what would it mean to live in a zombie apocalypse much better than films do, because films have 90 minutes to kind of address a narrative, whereas Walking Dead had 7 seasons or whatever. So the grim reality of day to day, what do you do to survive? What does that mean for your relationships? What does that mean to your own humanity, to be surrounded by death? Horrific kind of visions of seeing the people that you love eaten and so on. So, and it was able to experiment with the genre much more as well. What do you do if you've got to walk through a forest and there's zombies hanging from trees? As silly as that sounds, it was able to explore these little questions that we probably had in our minds a lot more, because it's a kind of a serial form of kind of entertainment, television being serial form. So all the questions about life, hope, love, relationships, humanity are questions that were able to be really kind of explored a lot more in TV series like Z Nation and The Walking Dead. I think films have to work harder now to do that because of subscription television.
And the pace of the plot, it has to be much more plot driven, so you don't have as much time to sit in those very sort of silent moments of what it means to be in a society that is collapsing, and you will succumb to it at some point.
I'm going to go a little bit more meta on that. I just picking up on your point about, the zombies are us. I think that in many ways that feeds into horror as a broader genre at its best. Going back at least to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I think when horror is good and when horror is important and when it's fun and when it's meaningful and ideally when it's also disgusting, it's about this kind of empathy with the outsider or the other. And I'm not saying every single horror film does that, but I think the ones that really have meaning and really hit a nerve are films that latch onto that in some way. And that ask us to sort of take, and I think that's why feminist filmmakers and filmmakers of colour have really picked up and run with horror, especially in recent years. Although maybe it's a case that they've always been interested, but now the industry is realising, okay, maybe we need to share the conch, maybe we need to get other people the funds and the access and the distribution to make these films. So things like Dark Place. We had Tracy Moffat's Bedevil, we had Warwick Thornton's The Dark Side. Yeah. These are really amazing films, but we need hundreds more films like these. We need to get people making, people who haven't traditionally been given the option to make film in general, but horror especially. And we're finding these stories. But even in the mainstream, even going back, we talked about Bela Lugosi before, this idea of the kind of feminized Eastern European other, there's a real kind of sadness and almost empathy to him. He's a villain, but he's kind of who we kind of are with him. You know, I mean, I watch those films and I'm more with him. There's a great Universal film called Dracula's Daughter. It's a very famous queer horror film from the Universal era. And it's devastating. I think it's one of the most beautiful horror films. It's not a zombie film, but it's, again, it really gets us to kind of think, you know, we're really aligned with this queer woman. And that's not something that was happening a lot in 1940s cinema. 1930s cinema.
So if you were to think of zombie films, especially Australian zombie films, are there one or two films that you think have really gone unnoticed and are things that are worth revisiting as exemplars of the genre?
Well, the one we were talking about by email before this panel, it's not a good film, but it's very interesting, was Zombie Brigade back in the 80s. Has anyone seen that? It's a really low-budget, bizarre Australian horror film.
I love it.
Yeah, it's really... So it's about a brigade of Australian Vietnam veterans come back to Australia, but they'd been infected by some type of Viet Cong pathogen, and so they were being kept in a graveyard or something like that,
Yep.
and then an unscrupulous developer came in and dug up the graveyard and unleashed these zombie vampire...
How could people see this film? Can you put it on YouTube for everyone?
I think it is on YouTube.
Yeah.
But the catch was, not only the Viet Cong had also created some type of vampire, I think. So the Zombie Brigade,
wow. So
the Australian Zombie Brigade were fighting the vampires in the outback Australia, and
the protagonists, the couple, the kind of romance at the core, it's an Indigenous man and a Vietnamese woman. Kim Lam, who was in Das Kapital.
And they're relying on the Indigenous elder to kind of give
Yeah.
them knowledge about how I can't remember whether this...
I don't think they thought it out too well.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not,
The funniest,
potholes all the way through.
the funniest thing about this movie is it gears up to this massive fight between the Zombie Brigade and the vampire Viet Cong, and they ran out of budget, and so they covered the entire battle scene with a screen card that says, "And the battle raged on."
it's got to be on YouTube. I don't think anybody would have put in a copyright claim for this.
It's not
one.
a great film, but it's a great idea.
So I guess, you know, Alex, do you have one film that you would put as your shout out for people to go and find?
I'm
on
always
a
going to go
sleepy
for my
Sunday?
girls. I got to give a shout out to the women filmmakers of horror who have for so long been sort of underrated. We always have our top 10, you know, Catherine Bigelow and the Soskers. You know, these are amazing women, but they're literally, like my book, 1,000 Women in Horror, plug. I have a filmography of over 800 women-directed horror films. Most of them you can't access. A lot of them the directors themselves don't even have copies of. Caroline Helsgaard, a German filmmaker, made a film last year called Endzeit Ever After, which is a German feminist zombie film, which is extraordinary. Grace Lee is an American documentary filmmaker. She won a Peabody Award for her documentary filmmaking, very serious grown-up films. She made a zombie mockumentary called American Zombie in 2007, which is about the development and growth of a zombie civil rights movement. It's impossible to watch that and not think of like the Extinction rallies, and it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Little Joe I've mentioned, and you know, we have male allies. There's a film a couple of years ago called The Girl with All the Gifts by Colm McCarthy, which is extraordinary. And you've mentioned Zombie Child, the Bertrand Bonello film, which I think is one of the most, I mean, it just harkens straight back to that Haitian independence story that I started off with. I mean, these are really important films about gender and race, that intersection, that just, they can't be separated.
Yeah, and I think this idea of labour as well, that was the other thing that kept coming up in so many, and I guess seeing, you know, a cluster of films in very tight succession was this idea of labour and the value of humanity and what we're prepared to pay for labour. And I do think that these are sort of concerns that these are not going away, you know, anytime soon for us as a society.
If I could just plug two more Australian
Plug
zombie
away.
films.
People should have a notebook out of there. Like,
I'm just remembering these obscure, because there's probably only about maybe 15 Aussie zombie films. But one that's kind of worth a look is Me and My Mates vs. the Zombie Apocalypse. And that's kind of what you'd expect. It's like a bogan Aussie ochre comedy, all the mates like drinking VB and like trying to take on the zombies, and it's kind of funny. But the other one is Hilltop Hoods. Yeah, the hip hop group. Is anyone here Hilltop Hoods fan? Yeah, they've actually got like an almost feature length film about they were recording an album when there was a zombie apocalypse, and then they're stuck inside an old jail or something like that, and so it's half movie, half kind of just them jamming and rapping. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like a 70-minute feature film, Hilltop Hood Zombie Apocalypse.
We got to give a shout out to the Neighbours Halloween special, right?
Oh yeah, which
It's
I
on
didn't know was
YouTube.
a thing, but all go home and
Zombies and-
YouTube that. Zombies and Neighbours, it's really great.
Zombies take over Ramsey Street.
And Lassiter's, like they take over Lassiter's first and you're like, oh my God, no. I also didn't realise that Harold had a shop, but that was a new revelation to me as well. I dropped out of Neighbours a while ago, so I was like, I didn't know zombies were there. I didn't know Harold had gone into a small business. So there's a lot to learn from the Lassiter's.
Did any of our favourite characters get bitten?
Well, there was a lot of great things where someone came into their house and they, instead of turning the lights on, they just got out their iPhone and started looking. And I was like, this is so great. So yeah, I would like to actually see if there's it said to be continued, and then I couldn't find the rest of it on YouTube, so I felt a bit ripped off. So we have to wrap it up, but I want to just know from both of you very quickly, why does the zombie endure? What is next?
Fear of losing free will, and it will never go. Like kids and broccoli. That's like I keep coming back to that. We will fight we will fight for free will, and zombies capture that perfectly. They always have, and they always will.
We will, as humans, we will always have fears, and I think zombies will be one kind of container that can be used to represent them. So I think, yeah, they're a good metaphor to represent our fears, so they will continue to be so.
And I think that people are just really grossed out by the idea of their skin falling off. So there's a lot of people like, I don't want that to be me. But they are incredibly fascinating. I think in the next, definitely in the next 12 months, there will be more and more of these particular ghouls lurking around, a lot of big art house films as well. So I hope that you will join me following the ghouls through the next sort of 12 months of cinema. But for now, can you please thank our fabulous panel?